The unthinkable is now operational. We're watching the deployment of a weapon system that fundamentally rewrites the calculus of nuclear deterrence, and most Americans have no idea what this means for their future. What we're witnessing isn't just another arms race headline. This is the materialization of a strategic nightmare that Russian military planners have warned about for 2 decades. A hypersonic delivery system capable of reaching Moscow before any meaningful response can be coordinated. But here's what the mainstream narrative won't tell you. This isn't about American strength or Russian weakness. This is about the deliberate dismantling of the strategic stability framework that kept us alive through the Cold War. Every weapon system like this pushes us closer to a hair-trigger world where miscalculation becomes inevitable. The military-industrial complex calls this deterrence. History calls it the prelude to catastrophe. Putin's reaction isn't shock. It's the recognition that mutual assured destruction just became mutual assured annihilation on a timeline measured in minutes, not hours. And the American people, they're being sold a story of dominance while the foundations of global security crumble beneath their feet. And this isn't about picking sides. This is about understanding the game that's being played with all of our lives. Now let's talk about what's actually happening here, because the details matter more than you might think. The weapon system we're discussing represents a technological leap that most people don't fully grasp. We're not talking about faster missiles in the traditional sense. We're talking about a fundamental shift in the physics of warfare. Hypersonic weapons travel at speeds exceeding Mach 5, which is 5 times the speed of sound, and some of these systems can reach Mach 20 or beyond. But speed is only part of the equation. What makes these weapons truly destabilizing is their maneuverability. Traditional intercontinental ballistic missiles follow predictable parabolic trajectories. You launch them, they arc up into space, and they come down on their target. This predictability is what made Cold War-era missile defense systems at least theoretically possible. You could calculate the trajectory, position your interceptors, and attempt to shoot them down. But hypersonic glide vehicles change everything. They don't follow predictable paths. They can maneuver in ways that make interception nearly impossible with current technology. They can zig and zag, adjust their course mid-flight, and approach targets from unexpected angles. This isn't just an incremental improvement. This is a paradigm shift that renders decades of defensive planning obsolete. Let me take you back to understand how we got here, because none of this happened in a vacuum. After the Cold War ended, there was a brief moment when it seemed like humanity might actually step back from the nuclear precipice. The Soviet Union had collapsed, the Warsaw Pact had dissolved, and there was genuine talk about building a new security architecture for Europe. Russia, weakened and desperate for integration into the Western economic system, was willing to make extraordinary concessions. They withdrew from Eastern Europe, they agreed to arms reduction treaties, they even proposed joining NATO at various points. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Instead of seizing this opportunity to build genuine collective security, Western planners saw an opening for something else entirely. They saw a chance to lock in American hegemony while Russia was too weak to resist. NATO didn't dissolve or transform into a pan-European security organization. Instead, it expanded eastward, absorbing former Warsaw Pact countries and even former Soviet republics. Every Russian leader, from Yeltsin to Putin, warned that this expansion was a red line. They explained repeatedly and clearly that Russia could not accept hostile military infrastructure on its borders. These weren't irrational demands. These were the same security concerns that have driven Russian foreign policy for centuries, rooted in geography and historical experience. But these warnings were ignored, dismissed as the complaints of a has-been power that no longer mattered. The real inflection point came in the early 2000s when the United States withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. This treaty, signed in 1972, was one of the cornerstones of strategic stability during the Cold War. The logic was elegant in its simplicity. If both sides knew that any nuclear first strike would result in devastating retaliation, neither side would launch. But if one side developed effective missile defenses, that calculus changed. Suddenly, a first strike became thinkable because you might be able to shoot down the retaliatory strike. The ABM Treaty prevented this destabilizing scenario by limiting both sides to minimal missile defense systems. When the United States withdrew from this treaty in 2002, citing the need to defend against rogue states like North Korea and Iran, Russian strategists immediately understood the real implications. This wasn't about North Korea, this was about negating Russia's nuclear deterrent. The missile defense installations that subsequently appeared in Poland and Romania were positioned to intercept Russian missiles, not Iranian ones. Russian officials pointed this out repeatedly, but their concerns were dismissed as paranoia. Now here's where it gets really interesting, and this is something the mainstream media consistently fails to explain. Russia's development of its own hypersonic weapons, including the avant-garde hypersonic glide vehicle, the Kinzhal air-launched ballistic missile, and the Zircon hypersonic cruise missile, wasn't aggressive expansionism. It was a direct response to American missile defense deployments. Putin himself explained this in his 2018 address to the Federal Assembly, though Western media largely ignored the strategic logic he laid out. He essentially said, "You're building a shield, so we're building a sword that can pierce that shield. You're trying to negate our deterrent, so we're developing weapons that make your defenses irrelevant." This is classic action-reaction dynamics in arms racing, the same pattern we saw throughout the Cold War. What's happening now, with American deployment of its own hypersonic capabilities, is the next turn of this spiral. And each turn makes the world more dangerous because it compresses decision-making time and increases the likelihood of catastrophic miscalculation. Let's talk about what this means in practical terms, because when we're discussing weapons that can strike Moscow in minutes, we're not engaging in abstract theorizing. We're talking about the potential end of human civilization. The current system of nuclear deterrence, for all its flaws, has worked for nearly 80 years because it includes certain stabilizing factors. One of the most important is decision-making time. If Russian early warning systems detect a missile launch from American territory, Russian leadership has approximately 30 minutes before impact. 30 minutes to assess whether the warning is real or a false alarm, to contact American leadership through hotlines, to make the most consequential decision in human history. This is terrifyingly short, but it's something. There have been multiple instances during the Cold War where false alarms nearly triggered nuclear war, but level-headed individuals had just enough time to verify that the warnings were errors. Stanislav Petrov, in 1983, for example, correctly identified a computer error that showed American missiles inbound when no such launch had occurred. He had time to think, to assess, to make the right call. But what happens when that 30-minute window becomes a 5-minute window or a 3-minute window? The cognitive psychology of decision-making under extreme time pressure is well documented. When humans are forced to make critical decisions in compressed time frames, we default to pre-programmed responses. We don't have time for careful analysis, for weighing alternatives, for double-checking information. We rely on instinct and training. And in a scenario where you have minutes to decide whether incoming objects are hostile missiles or a sensor malfunction, the pressure to launch on warning becomes overwhelming. This is what strategists call a hair-trigger posture, and it's inherently unstable. It means that a technical glitch, a cyber attack that spoofs sensor data, or even a flock of geese that confuses radar systems could potentially trigger a nuclear exchange. The shorter the warning time, the higher the probability of this nightmare scenario, and that's exactly where these hypersonic weapons are taking us. Now, I want you to consider something that should trouble everyone regardless of their political views or national loyalties. Who benefits from this situation? Not the American people, certainly, not the Russian people, not anyone who would actually have to live through a nuclear war, which means effectively no one because there wouldn't be much living to do afterward. So who's pushing this? Who's advocating for these weapon systems? The answer is the same collection of interests that have driven military policy for decades. The defense contractors who make billions from every new weapons program. The think tanks funded by those contractors who produce studies showing why we desperately need these new systems. The retired generals who sit on corporate boards and rotate between the Pentagon and defense industry. The political leaders who receive campaign contributions from these companies and who face pressure from constituencies that depend on defense manufacturing jobs. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented, open, legal influence that shapes policy in directions that benefit a narrow set of interests while exposing everyone else to existential risks. Eisenhower warned about this in his farewell address in 1961, calling it the military-industrial complex. He explained that the conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry was new in American experience, and that the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power existed and would persist. He urged citizens to guard against the unwarranted influence of this complex, whether sought or unsought. That was more than 60 years ago, and the problem has only intensified. The defense industry is now more concentrated, more powerful, and more deeply embedded in the political system than ever before. And what we're seeing with hypersonic weapons is a textbook example of how this system operates. Create a threat narrative, develop an expensive solution to that threat, secure funding for research and deployment, then watch as the other side develops countermeasures that justify the next round of spending. It's a perpetual motion machine fueled by taxpayer money and lubricated by the blood of people who die in the proxy wars and regional conflicts that result from this endless escalation. Let's examine the economic dimension of this, because it's crucial to understanding why these policies persist despite their obvious dangers. The United States currently spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. The 2024 defense budget exceeded $800 billion, and that doesn't include intelligence agencies, nuclear weapons maintenance handled by the Department of Energy, or veterans' benefits. This is an enormous transfer of resources from productive economic activity into systems designed for destruction. Now, proponents argue that defense spending creates jobs and drives technological innovation. There's some truth to this. Defense contracts do employ people, and military research has led to technologies like GPS and the internet. But here's what they don't tell you. Economic studies consistently show that defense spending is one of the least efficient forms of economic stimulus. That same money invested in infrastructure, education, healthcare, or green energy would create more jobs and generate more economic growth. $1 billion spent on education creates more employment than $1 billion spent on fighter jets, because education is labor-intensive, while military hardware is capital-intensive. The economic case for massive defense spending doesn't hold up under scrutiny, but it continues because the beneficiaries of that spending have disproportionate political influence. The human cost of these priorities is staggering when you really stop to think about it. Every dollar spent on hypersonic weapons is a dollar not spent on addressing climate change, which poses an existential threat potentially greater than nuclear war. It's a dollar not spent on pandemic preparedness, as COVID-19 demonstrated we desperately need. It's a dollar not spent on fixing crumbling infrastructure, improving education, or providing healthcare. Americans are told constantly that there's no money for social programs, that we can't afford universal healthcare or free college education, that Social Security needs to be reformed because it's unsustainable, but somehow there's always money for new weapon systems, even ones that make us less safe by increasing the risk of nuclear war. The opportunity cost is invisible but profound. We're mortgaging our future, literally and figuratively, to feed a military machine that serves the interests of a narrow elite while making the world more dangerous for everyone else. Now let's address the geopolitical implications more directly, because this isn't just about US-Russia relations. China is watching all of this very carefully and drawing its own conclusions. China has traditionally maintained a minimum deterrent nuclear posture, meaning they kept a relatively small nuclear arsenal designed solely to ensure they could retaliate if attacked. But as they watch the United States develop both advanced missile defenses and hypersonic strike weapons, they're rapidly expanding their nuclear capabilities. Satellite imagery shows massive construction of new missile silos. Intelligence estimates suggest China could have 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035, up from around 400 currently. This is a direct response to the eroding credibility of their deterrent. If the United States can strike first with hypersonic weapons and then use missile defenses to intercept the degraded retaliatory strike, China's minimum deterrent becomes insufficient. So they're building more weapons, which means more targets, more complexity, more potential for miscalculation. We're not just restarting the Cold War arms race, we're expanding it to 3 major powers simultaneously. The proxy conflicts we're seeing around the world need to be understood in this context as well. Ukraine, Syria, Taiwan, the South China Sea, these aren't isolated regional disputes. They're manifestations of the broader competition for global dominance that's intensifying as the unipolar moment fades. After the Cold War, the United States enjoyed a brief period of uncontested global hegemony, but that era is ending not because of American decline necessarily, but because of the natural multipolarity that emerges when other powers develop economically and technologically. China's economy has grown to rival America's. Russia has rebuilt its military capabilities. Regional powers like Iran and Turkey are asserting themselves. This diffusion of power is threatening to a foreign policy establishment that has grown accustomed to unilateral action and global dominance. So rather than adapting to a multipolar world and seeking stable arrangements with other major powers, American policy has doubled down on primacy. The goal, explicitly stated in strategy documents, is to prevent the emergence of any peer competitor. Hypersonic weapons fit into this strategy. They're tools for maintaining dominance, for preserving the ability to project power globally, for ensuring that no other country can effectively challenge American prerogatives. But here's the fundamental problem with this approach. It's not sustainable, and the attempt to sustain it is making conflict more likely. Russia and China aren't going to accept permanent subordinate status. They have their own interests, their own security concerns, their own visions for how the international system should operate. When you corner powerful countries, when you threaten their core interests, when you make them feel like they have no choice but to resist, you create the conditions for war. And in a world with nuclear weapons and increasingly destabilized deterrence relationships, that war could mean the end of everything. This isn't Russian or Chinese propaganda. This is basic international relations theory supported by centuries of historical evidence. Great power competition, when poorly managed, leads to catastrophic wars. World War I started not because any leader wanted it, but because the system had become so rigid, so distrustful, so loaded with tripwires, that a regional crisis in the Balkans cascaded into global conflagration. We're building a similar system now, with fewer safeguards and more dangerous weapons. The propaganda environment we're living in makes it nearly impossible to have rational discussions about these issues. If you question the wisdom of aggressive policies toward Russia or China, you're immediately accused of being a puppet or an apologist for authoritarianism. If you suggest that maybe expanding NATO to Russia's borders was strategically unwise, you're told you're defending Putin's invasion of Ukraine. This is deliberate framing that shuts down debate. You can simultaneously believe that Putin's invasion was illegal and immoral, while also recognizing that NATO expansion created the security dilemma that contributed to the crisis. You can oppose Chinese human rights abuses while also acknowledging that American policy toward Taiwan is provocative and risky. These aren't contradictory positions. They're the kind of nuanced thinking that's required for navigating complex geopolitical realities. But nuance doesn't serve the interests of those who benefit from perpetual tension and military spending. So we get simplistic narratives, good versus evil framing, and anyone who complicates the story gets marginalized or attacked. What makes this particularly insidious is that many smart, well-intentioned people buy into these narratives because they're wrapped in the language of values and human rights. We're told that opposing Russia and China is about defending democracy and human rights. And yes, both countries have authoritarian governments with poor human rights records. That's not in dispute. But if you look at actual American foreign policy rather than the rhetoric, you quickly realize that human rights and democracy are pretexts, not genuine motivations. The United States supports authoritarian regimes all over the world when it suits strategic interests. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, various dictatorships in Africa and Asia, they all receive American support because they align with American interests. The issue isn't whether other countries are democratic. The issue is whether they comply with American preferences. Countries that defy American wishes get sanctioned, encircled, threatened, or invaded. Regardless of their political systems, this is power politics dressed up in moral language, and it's crucial to see through this if you want to understand what's actually happening. The situation we're in now, with these hypersonic weapons and the broader deterioration of strategic stability, is the result of choices made over decades by people operating within this system. It didn't have to be this way. There were multiple off-ramps, multiple opportunities to choose a different path. After the Cold War, we could have built genuine collective security. In the 2000s, we could have included Russia in European security architecture instead of isolating them. In the 2010s, we could have worked with China to manage the transition to a multipolar world instead of treating their rise as a threat to contain. At every juncture, short-term thinking, ideological rigidity, and the influence of vested interests pushed us toward confrontation rather than cooperation. And now we're reaping the consequences in the form of renewed great power competition, arms racing, and the highest risk of nuclear war since the 1980s. So what can be done about this? That's the question everyone asks, and it's the hardest one to answer because the forces driving these policies are deeply entrenched. But recognizing the problem is the first step. Most Americans have no idea that strategic stability is eroding, that the risk of nuclear war is increasing, that their tax dollars are funding weapon systems that make them less safe. The mainstream media doesn't cover these issues with the depth and urgency they deserve. Politicians don't campaign on arms control because it's not a winning issue with voters who don't understand the stakes. So the first thing that needs to happen is education, awareness, and public pressure. People need to understand that this isn't abstract policy debate. This is about whether human civilization continues to exist. And once enough people understand that, they need to demand different priorities from their political leaders. They need to make it politically costly to keep feeding the arms race and politically beneficial to pursue genuine diplomacy and arms control. The technical solutions exist. There are proposals for extending warning times, for creating buffer zones, for new treaties limiting hypersonic weapons and other destabilizing technologies. The problem isn't lack of ideas, the problem is lack of political will, and that comes back to who has power and whose interests are being served. Until we address the fundamental corruption of our political system by moneyed interests, particularly defense contractors and the military-industrial complex, we're going to keep sleepwalking toward catastrophe. This isn't a partisan issue, by the way. Both parties are thoroughly captured by these interests. Democratic and Republican administrations alike have pursued these dangerous policies. The solution requires going beyond traditional partisan politics to build a movement that puts human survival above corporate profits and geopolitical ambitions. That sounds dramatic, but it's not hyperbole. We are genuinely playing Russian roulette with the future of the species, and most people don't even know the gun is loaded.